wrong carriage. Two guards had my arms pinned before me, and the magistrate at the front of the hall was already reading my charges aloud. Something about theft, something about endangering the crown. I remember the words reaching me from very far away, as though I were hearing them underwater, when the doors at the back of the chamber crashed open with enough force to rattle the torches in their brackets. "She has done nothing." The king's voice tore across that hall before I even saw him. Sigurd moved faster than I had ever seen a monarch move, his wolf a full stride ahead of him, teeth already bared at the men holding my arms. "Release her, now." I did not yet know whether he had arrived in time to undo whatever Lord Wulfric had spent the better part of 2 days constructing against me. All I knew in that moment was that 4 nights earlier, my only ambition in life had been finding somewhere dry to sit down. So let me back up. Let me tell you properly how a baker's apprentice ended up standing accused in a king's own court, because none of it would have happened at all if not for a storm loud enough to drown out my own thoughts, and a carriage door I opened without once checking whose carriage it actually was. A storm and a door. I was 22 that year, apprenticed to a baker in a river town 2 days' ride south of the capital, and I had just finished a shift no reasonable person should have agreed to. A colleague had fallen ill that morning, and I'd covered her hours on top of my own, kneading and proofing and stoking ovens until well past dark. I'd arranged that same morning to catch the public coach that ran the northern road twice a week, the one that would carry me home. By the time my shift finally ended, the storm had rolled in with such force that I could barely make out the inn yard where the coach was supposed to be waiting. Through the sheeting rain, I saw a carriage sitting dark and unattended near the inside entrance, and I did not think twice. I climbed inside without checking a crest, without checking anything at all. I was soaked to the bone, past the point of careful judgment, grateful beyond words for 4 solid walls and a bench to collapse onto. I remember thinking, in the last clear moment before exhaustion swallowed me whole, that the cushions were considerably finer than anything the public coach usually offered. I did not think much further than that. I was asleep within minutes. I woke to warmth and weight and the particular confusion of not immediately knowing where I was. The weight I discovered as I blinked myself into the gray early light was an enormous wolf curled protectively along the length of the bench beside me, its great head resting against my knee with the total unbothered devotion of an old hound that had already decided I belonged to it. I did the only sensible thing a person half asleep and thoroughly confused knows how to do. I scratched behind its ears, told it quietly that it was a very good and very large dog, and settled back down for another hour of sleep, reasoning that whatever household owned such a fine carriage clearly kept excellent animals, and I saw no cause for alarm. I woke properly some time later to the sound of several men arguing in low, urgent voices just outside the carriage door. "It will not move, Your Grace. We've tried everything short of dragging it bodily, and I would not recommend that given its current mood." I am aware of its mood. What I am asking is why it has developed this particular mood over an unconscious stranger in my own carriage. I sat up slowly, wide awake now, and found myself looking through the open door at a tall man in traveling clothes, flanked by a knot of visibly nervous attendants, every one of them staring at the wolf still curled possessively across my lap as though it had personally ruined their morning. "I'm so sorry," I said, scrambling upright and dislodging the wolf with considerable effort. "I didn't realize this was your carriage. I mistook it for the public coach in the storm last night. I'll be on my way immediately, I promise. I didn't mean any harm." The wolf, apparently unwilling to let my apology end in my departure, planted itself firmly between me and the open door, sat down and fixed the tall man with a look that managed, despite being an animal entirely incapable of speech, to convey unmistakable defiance. "It appears," the man said in the exhausted tone of someone narrating events he did not yet believe himself, "that my wolf has developed an opinion on the matter." "Your wolf," I repeated slowly. "I am King Sigurd," he said, "and this, apparently, is my wolf, though I confess I have never once seen it behave this way in my life. I would very much appreciate an explanation, if you happen to have one, because I certainly do not." I did not have one. 30 seconds earlier, I had believed myself to be petting an unusually affectionate dog belonging to some wealthy stranger. I was, in every direction, considerably out of my depth. "I'm Aiden," I said, because it was the only useful thing I had to offer. "I bake bread. I don't know why your wolf has taken an interest in me. I promise I did nothing to encourage it beyond scratching its ears, which I'd have done for any dog that climbed uninvited into my lap." Something complicated moved across Sigurd's face. Bewilderment, mostly, layered over something else I did not yet know how to name. "It has never done this before," he said again, quieter now, more to himself than to me. "Not once in my entire reign has it shown the slightest interest in anyone beyond simple courtesy." By then, a small crowd of inn staff and curious travelers had gathered at a respectful but thoroughly interested distance, watching a king and his wolf negotiate with an unremarkable baker's apprentice as though it were the finest entertainment the storm-soaked morning had to offer. His attendant, a lean, careful man named Oren, cleared his throat. "Your Grace, we are still parked in an inn yard with considerable foot traffic. Perhaps this conversation might continue somewhere less exposed." I looked down at the wolf still sitting firmly between me and any hope of a quiet exit, and understood with a sinking feeling that my morning was about to become considerably more complicated than a missed coach. The ride to the palace. I protested the entire arrangement, loudly and at length, informing anyone who would listen that a bakery did not run itself, and that my absence would be noticed within the hour. No one seemed particularly moved, least of all the wolf, who pressed itself more firmly against my legs each time I tried to argue my case, as though physical proximity alone might settle the matter faster than words. I was escorted to the palace over my own repeated objections, the wolf refusing to be more than an arm's length from me the entire journey, curling around my feet at every stop with a proprietary determination that made half the traveling party visibly nervous and the other half openly amused. "He hasn't eaten since yesterday," one of the younger guards confided to me quietly, during a stop to change horses. "Refused his breakfast this morning because you were still asleep, and he wouldn't leave your side long enough to reach the food." I didn't know what to do with the particular tenderness of that fact, so I simply reached down and scratched behind the wolf's ears again, and felt its tail thump once against the carriage floor in what I could only describe as satisfaction. Sigurd rode alongside the carriage for most of the journey rather than inside it, which I understood, once I thought about it properly, was probably because his own wolf had thoroughly claimed the available seating. He found me himself once we'd reached the palace, after I'd been given a modest guest chamber to dry out in, still wrapped in a plain gray traveling cloak a kind attendant had lent me, while my own soaked clothes were taken to be cleaned. "I owe you an apology," he said, standing somewhat awkwardly in the doorway. "This is not how guests to my household are usually received, wolf-guarded carriage rides notwithstanding." "I'd say this isn't how anyone's morning usually goes," I said, "wolf included." Something flickered across his face. The closest thing to a real laugh I would come to learn, he allowed himself easily. "That may be the single most accurate assessment of this entire situation I've heard yet," he said. "May I ask why this troubles you so much? Surely a king's wolf taking a shine to a stray baker is more amusing than alarming." His expression sobered. "My wolf's judgment has never once been wrong about anything that mattered in my life. If it has decided something about you that I do not yet understand, I owe us both the honesty of trying to understand it properly, rather than sending you home and pretending this morning never happened." That's a considerable amount of trust to place in an animal's opinion. "It's the only opinion I've ever trusted with anything that mattered," he said. "I inherited this crown at 19, younger than I was prepared for, and I learned quickly that most people around a king want something from the crown rather than anything honest from the man wearing it. My wolf has never once wanted anything from me but my own good judgment. I've learned to take its instincts more seriously than I take most of my counsel's advice." "Then I suppose I'm in good company," I said, "being trusted by an animal that apparently outranks half your court." He laughed properly then, the sound seeming to surprise him nearly as much as it surprised me, and I understood, watching him recover from his own unguarded amusement, that I'd just witnessed something his composed public face didn't often allow anyone to see. Days at the palace. I stayed at the palace far longer than a missed coach should have accounted for, because once Sigurd had properly apologized for the chaos of that first morning, he made no particular effort to send me home. And because his wolf, given any choice in the matter, refused to settle anywhere I was not also present. Those first days taught me more about a king's household than I had ever expected to learn. Sigurd ruled with an easy, unbothered authority that filled a room without seeming to try. And yet I noticed almost immediately that his composure slipped whenever his wolf did something new and undignified in my presence, which it seemed determined to do at every opportunity. It stole a joint of roasted meat directly off the formal supper table on my third evening, depositing it proudly at my feet in front of two visiting dignitaries. An act of such total disregard for royal decorum that even the stone-faced steward had to excuse himself to compose his own expression. It refused flatly to let any servant but me bring its water bowl, sitting pointedly by the kitchen door each morning until I personally carried it through. It took to sleeping outside my chamber door every night, a fact the household staff found endlessly entertaining and Sigurd found endlessly mortifying. "I don't understand what's gotten into him," he said more than once, watching his own wolf do something newly ridiculous in pursuit of my attention. "I believe the wolf understands considerably more than you currently do," I told him, which I confess I find charming rather than concerning. It was Oren who first explained to me, gently but plainly, exactly how tangled my sudden presence had become in matters I hadn't known existed. "There's a betrothal under negotiation," he told me on the fifth day, choosing his words with the care of a man delivering news he suspected wouldn't land gently. "To Lady Ryan of the Eastern Holdings, arranged by Lord Wolfric, the king's chief advisor, to secure trade rights along a pass this kingdom badly needs. Your presence and the wolf's very public devotion to you has become considerably inconvenient for a negotiation that was, until 4 days ago, proceeding smoothly." "I didn't ask to become inconvenient," I said. "I'm aware," Oren said. "I would simply ask you to be careful regardless. Lord Wolfric has invested a great deal of personal effort into that arrangement, and men who invest heavily in something rarely enjoy watching it unravel over a baker's apprentice." I did not fully understand the weight of that warning until I met Lord Wolfric himself 2 days later, in a corridor he had clearly been waiting in. He was pleasant in the particular way that makes a threat land harder than open hostility would, complimenting my composure, my modest bearing, the admirable novelty of the whole situation before arriving with practiced smoothness at his real point. "It would be a considerable kindness," he said, "if you were simply to return home. The crown would compensate you generously, of course, considerably more than a baker's apprentice typically sees in a lifetime. It would spare you the burden of a court entirely unsuited to your upbringing, and spare this kingdom a diplomatic complication it can ill afford." "That's a great deal of concern for my burden," I said, "from a man I've known for considerably less than 5 minutes. Something in his smile went very still. "Consider it all the same," he said, and left without waiting for an answer. What's Sigurd Sayed? I found Sigurd that same evening and told him plainly what had been suggested to me. "He's approached you already," Sigurd said, his jaw tightening in a way I hadn't yet seen from him. I suspected he might, once word of my wolf's behavior reached him properly. I didn't expect it this soon. "Should I simply go home?" I asked. It would resolve his negotiation cleanly enough. He was quiet a long moment, and when he finally answered, his voice had lost the careful, bewildered formality he usually wore around me. "I don't want you to go home," he said. "I've spent 5 days telling myself my wolf's attachment is strange instinct, something to be managed rather than understood. I no longer believe that. I find I'm considerably more interested in a baker's apprentice who scratches a stray wolf's ears without a second thought than in a betrothal arranged for trade rights I was never once properly consulted about." I didn't have an answer ready for that, so I said nothing, and let the quiet hold it the way quiet had come to hold most true things between us since the morning I woke in his carriage. The buried clause. In the days that followed, I found myself quietly wondering why Wolfric's investment in that betrothal ran so deep. His corridor visit had not settled easily in my mind. It was Oren, cross-referencing the marriage contract's finer terms at my urging, who finally found the detail that mattered. Buried in a clause few beyond the negotiating parties had ever bothered reading closely was a substantial land grant promised to Wulfric's own family upon the marriage's successful completion. A personal fortune considerably larger than his advisor's salary alone would ever provide. Contingent entirely on a wedding, my presence now threatened to derail. He hasn't been protecting this kingdom's trade interests, Oren said grimly. He's been protecting his own fortune, dressed up as diplomacy, and he stands to lose a great deal of it if this betrothal collapses. I sat with that discovery a long while, understanding, with the cold clarity of a fact rearranging everything around it, that Wulfric's pleasant corridor visit had never been about the kingdom's welfare at all. It had been about his own. I brought the finding to Sigurd myself that evening. He read Oren's notes twice, his jaw tightening with each pass, and when he finally looked up, something in his face had gone colder than I had yet seen it. He served my father before me, and myself since I took the crown, he said. I trusted him the way you trust a fixture that's simply always been in the room. I didn't think to question whose interests a betrothal actually served beyond the kingdom's own. He set the notes down carefully. I am considerably less forgiving of that oversight now than I was an hour ago. You didn't know, I said. That isn't the same as being careless, he said, and I don't intend to make the distinction comfortable for myself. I understood, watching him, that whatever came next, he would not be looking away from it easily. The first accusation. Wulfric moved first, and moved fast, once his polite request had clearly failed to move me. 2 days later, a formal accusation reached the household steward. A piece of the king's own silver, discovered supposedly hidden among my few belongings, planted evidence dressed up as a servant's honest discovery. I was brought before the household's internal magistrate within the hour. The theft accusation, formal enough that even Sigurd's intervention couldn't immediately dismiss it without proper proceeding. Sigurd's wolf, present through the entire questioning, growled low and steady at anyone who raised their voice at me, which did little to help the formal appearance of the proceedings, but considerably steadied my own nerves throughout it. I had never in my life stood accused of anything, and I found the experience far more frightening than I let anyone see. My hands folded tightly in my lap while strangers debated my honesty as though I weren't present to defend it myself. It was the wolf's steady, warm weight against my leg that kept my voice from shaking when I was finally asked to speak in my own defense. The silver was traced within a day to Wulfric's own household stores, rather than the royal treasury it was meant to appear stolen from. A detail one sharp-eyed steward noticed simply by the maker's mark pressed into its base. The false accusation collapsed as quickly as it had been raised. But I understood, watching Wulfric's composure barely flicker at the failure, that he was not a man who accepted a single setback as a final defeat. The second accusation. His next move came 4 nights later, and it very nearly succeeded entirely. A formal charge reached the Crown's own court this time. Not simple theft, but a considerably graver accusation. I had, according to the charge, been sent deliberately by a rival territory to endanger the king through some vague and unspecified scheme. My sudden appearance in his carriage recast as calculated infiltration rather than a storm-soaked accident. The evidence, thin as it was, had been assembled carefully enough to force a formal hearing. And it was in that hearing, guards already holding my arms as the magistrate read the charge aloud, that Sigurd's wolf finally lost whatever patience it had left. This is the scene I told you about at the very beginning. The doors slamming open, Sigurd's voice tearing across the hall with a fury no king's usual composure should have allowed. "Release her," he said again, once he'd reached us, his wolf already snarling between me and the guards. "This charge is built on nothing beyond convenient timing and a rival negotiation. Someone here stands considerably more to lose than to gain from it." Oren arrived a step behind him, a stack of documents already in hand, and laid the true shape of it before the assembled magistrates. The silver's real origin, the marriage contract's buried land grant, a pattern of convenient accusations timed precisely to whatever threatened Wulfric's own fortune most directly. Wulfric's composure, so carefully maintained through the first failed accusation, finally broke entirely under the weight of evidence laid out plainly before witnesses who had no reason left to protect him.